colors. See the colors? These are bigger. Pistol.
A scarlet macaw doesn't live within 1,000 miles of Chaco Canyon. Its range stops in tropical Mexico. But archaeologists have pulled macaw bones out of Pueblo Bonito, the great house at Chaco's center, alongside cacao residue and copper bells from just as far south. No one flying that bird north had a compass. No one carrying that cacao had a paved road. The goods got there anyway, and so did the people carrying them. And figuring out how they pulled that off is one of the more astonishing pieces of engineering history barely talks about. Start with the simplest layer, because everything else builds on it. Long before anyone drew a line on paper, native nations across the continent were building maps in a completely different medium: memory. William Clark of Lewis and Clark described watching this happen firsthand. Indigenous guides would draw him directions in sand or dirt, piling it up for hills, scooping it out for river channels, marking villages and landmarks with whatever was on hand, and then letting the wind erase the whole thing once the information had transferred. The map wasn't the object. The map was the knowledge, held in a person's head, updated every season and taught forward. That memory system had to be precise, because the terrain punished error. A landmark wasn't just that mountain. It was that mountain from this specific angle at this specific time of year, cross-referenced against the sound of a particular stretch of river, or the shape a tree line made against the sky. Multiply that by every route a nation traveled regularly, for hunting, for trade, for seasonal migration, and you get something closer to an internal atlas than a set of directions. It lived in elders, it got tested by younger travelers under supervision, and it got corrected in real time when the land itself changed. Rivers did a lot of the heavy lifting on top of that memory. Waterways aren't just a way to move, they're a navigation system that draws itself. A river only flows one direction. Its tributaries branch in consistent patterns, and its banks change vegetation in ways a trained eye reads like signage. Nations across the eastern woodlands and the Pacific Northwest built extensive travel networks around watersheds, using canoes engineered for the specific water they'd be run on, from open ocean-going vessels on the northwest coast to lighter craft built for narrow inland rivers. Where water ran out, travoi, wooden frames dragged by people or dogs, carried goods across the gap until the next waterway picked up the route again. On dry land, those routes hardened into trails that stood the test of centuries. In the southwest, the people who built Chaco Canyon, ancestors of today's Pueblo nations, including the Hopi and the Rio Grande Pueblos, carved actual roads into the landscape. Some ran arrow straight for dozens of miles, regardless of what terrain stood in the way. Engineered wide enough for coordinated foot traffic, connecting Chaco to outlying communities across what's now the Four Corners region. Out in California, nations including the Achomawi, the Cahuilla, and dozens of others maintained trail networks so established that when American surveyors arrived centuries later, they simply paved over them. Sections of Highway 101, Highway 99, and Highway 50 in California sit on top of native trails that predate them by centuries, in some cases described by archaeologists as running back thousands of years. Those trails weren't just footpaths either. They were commercial corridors, with an actual economy running along them. The Achomawi traded salmon and woven tool baskets to the northern Paiute for bows and shell beads. The Cahuilla, further south, received gourd rattles from the Yuma and basketry from the Chemehuevi. Marine shell disc beads moved north from the San Francisco Bay all the way to Alaska, while pelts, sinew-backed bows, and worked stone moved the opposite direction, south into the Bay Area and beyond. That's an entire coastline's worth of nations, each one holding a piece of a supply chain that ran the length of the West Coast, long before the idea of a coastal highway existed. In the Pacific Northwest, the Nez Perce route that carried a band across Washington and into California's Sacramento Valley in the 1880s still carries the name Walla Walla Trail today. Speed mattered as much as accuracy, and several nations built dedicated systems around it. Long-distance running was a trained, disciplined skill in numerous native cultures, not a casual pastime. Among Apache and Hopi communities, runners carried messages and news across desert distances that would take a horse days to cover, using pacing techniques passed down deliberately from experienced runners to younger ones, the same way a modern coach builds an athlete's mileage over years rather than weeks. A message that needed to move fast didn't wait for a single traveler to walk the whole distance. It moved through a chain of runners, each one covering the stretch of country they knew best at a sustainable sprint, handing the message to the next relay point, the way a baton changes hands mid-race. The entire chain could outrun what any one person could sustain alone, which is the same logic that would later make Pony Express relay stations work. Except this system had been running for generations before that name existed. Here's where the toolkit stops being just about ground-level knowledge and starts reaching up. On the Great Plains, the Pawnee, along with the Arikara and the Wichita, developed something scholars call sky charts, star maps recorded on tanned hide that mapped constellations the way a modern chart maps coastlines. Researchers trace the tradition back roughly 1,000 years, plausibly connected to trade contact with peoples of Mexico and the Southwest. Unlike a European navigator triangulating position from a star's angle above the horizon, Plains sky charts were built to track time and season, telling a traveler not just which way was north, but when a specific journey needed to start, what the land would look like when they arrived, and which ceremonies lined up with which points in the year. Direction and timing weren't separate problems. They were the same problem, solved together. That same instinct for tying the sky to the ground shows up again in the Southwest, though it worked differently there. At Chaco Canyon, entire buildings were oriented to solstice light. On the correct morning of the year, sunlight cuts through a specific gap in the architecture and lands precisely where the builders intended it to land, centuries after they set the stones. That's not decoration. That's a calendar built into a structure large enough to walk through, accurate enough that modern astronomers can still verify it today. Pueblo peoples used distant landmarks the same way a sailor uses a lighthouse, fixing a mountain or a mesa on the horizon as a reference point, and building solstice and equinox tracking around exactly where the sun rose or set behind it each season. Whether the method was a hide chart on the plains or a doorway in a canyon wall, the underlying approach was identical. Turn the sky into a fixed, repeatable reference and let it tell you not just where you were, but when. Layer all of that together, memory maps, river systems, engineered trails, trained relay runners, and celestial timing, and you get a navigation toolkit that could move a person accurately across unfamiliar ground without a single metal instrument. But the real proof of how far that toolkit could reach isn't in any one person's journey, it's in the objects. Turquoise, mined at the Cerrillos deposits near Chaco Canyon, has turned up as far away as the Yucatan Peninsula, well over 1,000 miles south. Scarlet macaws, native to tropical Mexico, made the same distance, moving the opposite direction, ending up in aviaries built inside Pueblo Bonito. Farther east, chert stone, quarried only at Rama Bay on the coast of Labrador, has been found in archaeological sites as far south as Maine and as far west as Quebec's Trois-Rivières, moving hand to hand along a trade network that never touched a single road. That's stone tool material, heavy and unglamorous, still worth carrying hundreds of miles, because whatever a community traded for it, back was worth more locally than the chert itself. Copper, mined around Lake Superior, turns up in mounds, built hundreds of miles south by the People's Archaeologists Group under the name Hopewell, centred largely in what's now Ohio, alongside marine shell that had to have travelled north from the Gulf Coast. Pipestone, a soft red stone used for ceremonial pipes, comes from exactly one place on the continent, a quarry in what's now southwestern Minnesota. And yet, finished pipestone pieces turn up in sites hundreds of miles from that single source. Evidence of trade rather than travel, since every community that wanted it had exactly one source to trade toward. These gatherings where relay legs met weren't casual either. Certain locations became recognized meeting points, returned to across generations, because they sat at a natural junction of several nations' territories, often near a reliable water source or a landmark visible from a long way off. Cahokia, the massive settlement across the river from what's now St. Louis, functioned as exactly this kind of hub at continental scale, pulling in copper from the Great Lakes, shell from the Gulf, and, per the same turquoise trade record found at Chaco, stone from the southwest, all converging on one city built at the meeting point of two major rivers. A location like that wasn't chosen by accident. Its position was itself a piece of navigational knowledge, understood by every nation that travelled toward it. Picture how a single strand of that chain might have actually run. A trader from a community near the turquoise mines at Cerrillos packs a set of finished stones, walks a route he's covered a dozen times before, reads the mesa on the horizon the way his grandfather taught him to read it, and reaches a trading gathering 3 or 4 days out. He doesn't go further. Someone else does. A trader from a different nation who knows the next stretch of desert the way the first trader knew his, carrying the same stones onward along a route that eventually, after dozens of hands and hundreds of miles, ends somewhere in Mesoamerica, in exchange for macaw chicks and dried cacao that will make the return trip in reverse. Nobody in that chain ever saw both ends of it. Everybody in that chain trusted the next person's stretch of knowledge as much as they trusted their own. No single traveller walked any of these legs start to finish. That's the honest version of the story, and it's a more impressive one than a myth about one man's epic hike. This was relay, not a marathon. Village to village, nation to nation, each leg handled by people who knew their own stretch of country cold, handing goods and information forward like a message passed down a line that happened to be 3,000 miles long. Add up the reach of that relay, from the turquoise mines of the southwest to the cacao groves of Mesoamerica, from the copper country of the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast shell beds, from Labrador's chert quarries to inland New England, and the total span the network covered stretches well past 3,000 miles, corner to corner of a continent, sustained for centuries before anyone on it had ever seen a magnetic compass. It's worth clearing up what this wasn't, too. This wasn't luck. It wasn't some vague, innate sense of direction people are sometimes lazily credited with, as if geography just came naturally to entire nations without training or correction. Moss doesn't reliably grow only on the north side of trees, whatever the old scouting manuals claim. And nobody navigating 3,000 miles of trade network was betting their cargo on tree bark. This was measured, tested, taught knowledge, refined across generations, the same way any engineering discipline gets refined. Build it, watch where it fails, fix that specific failure, pass the corrected version forward. The people who ran this system weren't guessing well. They were executing a method. Root knowledge got taught deliberately, tested on young travelers before they carried anything valuable alone, and corrected by elders who had walked the same ground decades earlier. A young runner didn't get handed a message to carry 300 miles on his first attempt. He ran the short local legs for years first, under watch, until an experienced runner judged his pacing and his landmark memory solid enough to trust with something that mattered. Losing a shipment of turquoise, or worse, losing a person, meant the system had failed somebody's careful teaching, not that the land had simply won. Every one of the tools involved, the sand map, the star chart, the memorized river, the maintained trail, the trained relay of runners, functioned as infrastructure in the fullest sense. It just didn't need pavement or paper or a compass needle to work. Weather and season complicated all of it, and the system accounted for that too. A trail that was reliable in autumn could be impassable after spring snowmelt turned a shallow crossing into a flood. Route knowledge wasn't a static set of directions memorized once. It was a living calendar, cross-referenced constantly against which month it was, what the plants along a given stretch looked like right now, and which rivers were safe to cross this week versus which ones would be safe again in a month. That's a harder problem than simply knowing where north is. It's knowing where north is, what the ground between here and there will actually do to you today, and adjusting the whole plan accordingly. And it isn't only history. The Pueblo nations descended from the people of Chaco Canyon are not a vanished civilization. They're living communities in New Mexico and Arizona today, and pieces of that same landscape knowledge. Which ridgelines mean what, which plants mark which season, still get taught along family lines. The instruments changed. GPS sits in a lot of pockets now, but the underlying skill, reading a landscape closely enough to trust your life to it, didn't disappear when the technology arrived. It just stopped being the only option. So when you picture 3,000 miles crossed without a compass or a road, picture it accurately. Not one person, alone, gritting it out, mile after mile. A relay of specific nations, each one holding a piece of an enormous shared system, passing turquoise and cacao and copper and knowledge hand to hand across a continent, for longer than most of the empires we study in school managed to survive. There was no satellite to check position against, no printed map to correct a wrong turn, just trained memory, read terrain, tracked stars, and a teaching system strict enough that a mistake got caught before it cost someone their life. Which is the more remarkable feat, crossing that distance once, or building a system precise enough to cross it reliably, generation after generation, without ever writing the directions down? Maybe it's not really a competition between the two. The system is what made repeated crossings possible at all, and the people who built it are still here to tell you how it worked, if you know who to ask. If you want to see how deep that kind of engineered memory goes, the story doesn't stop at the trade routes.